Bitcoin looks to be on the verge of a huge volatile price action move. So let's look at the data to see how big a move we can expect and what direction the move could be. Today we're going to be looking at Bitcoin's potential for a large volatile move in the very near future. And where better to start than the Bitcoin volatility chart we have here on bitcoinmagazinepro.com. Now what I've done here is just isolate the previous 1 year of price action and volatility, and we're looking at the 1 week volatility specifically. And what we can see is over the past few weeks, as Bitcoin's price action has been pretty boring, pretty terrible, just sideways, not a lot really happening, we can see volatility has absolutely plummeted, indicating that the amount of moves we're seeing in a trending direction for BTC are practically non-existent, which, like we said, doesn't really create very exciting price action or market conditions. Bitcoin has been hovering around this $95,000, $96,000 region for what feels like an eternity already. But what we can see is this level of low volatility is actually fairly rare for BTC. What I can do is if I just press this button here, hang on, work in progress. This button here, what we can see is right down here is where the Bitcoin volatility is currently at, which is at an incredibly low level. In fact, we've only seen volatility this low on 3 separate occasions previously for BTC in the past year. So what I can do is if I just isolate this here, if I move this way a little bit, we can see here is when we saw the first instance of this, and following that Bitcoin rallied from around $50,000 all the way up to a new all-time high at the time of around $74,000. The second instance was here, where Bitcoin's price was around $66,000 before we dipped to 55, back up to 68, back down to 50. So multiple different volatile moves following that region. And then here, when Bitcoin's price was again around this $60,000 level before a slight retrace and a massive run up to over $100,000 towards our current all-time high. So volatility this low is often very short-lived, and historically we can see it usually results in a pretty massive move for BTC. What we can also do, rather than just looking at this plain volatility metric, is if I just press this button here, what we can see is here on TradingView we have the Bollinger Bands, which are a pretty common and pretty popular metric for actually measuring Bitcoin's volatility. And it does this by just looking at a moving average, which is this white line, and the standard deviation bands around that. And what we can see is when Bitcoin has these big volatile moves, these bands widen as the standard deviation increases, and then the Bollinger Band widths increase as well as these bands get further apart. So what I'll do is just hide myself. And then what I've also done is change the Bollinger Band calculation duration from the standard length of 20 to 90 to see the quarterly volatility in BTC. And what we can see, the level of low volatility we currently have is all the way down here, which we haven't actually seen. We have to scroll all the way back to back here in 2012 was the last time the quarterly volatility, according to the Bollinger Band width, was this low for BTC. And following that, BTC had a massive breakout pretty much immediately following that of around 200% in a very short space of time, just a few months, well, a couple of weeks really. So Bitcoin being this coiled in almost like a spring always leads to these huge expansions in price action. I'll just bring myself back here. What we can see is, as I said, this doesn't happen too often, but what we can see is any comparable times, maybe not quite as low, we have seen similar moves for BTC. If I just get the drawing tool here, we can see a similar occurrence in 2018 before price plummeted about 50% from 6K to around 3K. Then if we just move further along, another instance of that around here where Bitcoin's price action coiled in as we were pretty sideways following the post-COVID recovery. And then following that again, we pumped from around 9K to 12K pretty quick back down again. And that really spurred the rally on to $40,000 at then an all-time high in Bitcoin's price. And since then, we haven't really had instances that low of price action volatility. I guess the other comparable one in the most recent history is around here when Bitcoin's price, again, we're just having this slow, grinding, choppy price action to about 25K before we popped up to 32K. Again, popped down very similar actually to what we saw in that previous cycle just post-COVID before we ran up to a new all-time high. So I do think we're on the verge of a big move in BTC, and historical indications are it could be 20, 30, if not 40% plus. So what kind of direction could we expect a move if we are to see something like that? Well, what we can look at is something like Bitcoin versus the US dollar strength index, or the DXY, which over the past few months has been rallying incredibly hard, which is actually pretty impressive to see Bitcoin's strength over the past few months, considering the strength of the US dollar has been increasing noticeably. Historically, these two have been inversely correlated. So when we see Bitcoin increasing, it's usually due to the US dollar strength decreasing and vice versa. If the dollar is decreasing in its strength, Bitcoin is usually having a pretty good time. But if we just zoom in over the current cycle here, we can see as Bitcoin rallied from around $50,000, $60,000 to over $100,000, the DXY was rallying incredibly hard, which probably limited Bitcoin's upside potential given the fact that there wasn't a massive appetite for risk on assets, especially considering the massively increasing strength of the dollar. But we can see as Bitcoin has been chopping in consolidation for a few months now, really, since we first initially broke above 100K in about November of last year, we have really been pretty stagnant, and it's only really over the past couple of weeks we've seen a bit of a trend change in this US dollar strength index, which maybe gives us some optimism that maybe Bitcoin's next big move could be again to the upside. This is a little clearer on the BTC versus DXY year-on-year chart here. So again, rather than just looking at the raw values, we're looking at the year-on-year change in this. And this makes it really obvious the massive trend change we've seen in this. And another thing that's really interesting and probably quite favorable for BTC is it's not often you get a new US president coming in where we have an exact case study of what they did last time in office and what they're likely to do this time. So what we can do is just zoom in over the previous couple cycles here. And what we can see is very similar price action, well, data action in the US dollar strength index climbing to the upside here in 2017 until around February, March time. Again, Trump came in, and it's very favorable for economies to not have a currency that is too strong. It definitely encourages better exports and just a general increase in economic output if you have a slightly weaker currency. So following Trump's inauguration, what we could see is the US dollar strength massively decline. Following that, we saw Bitcoin's price massively rally from around, at the time, just $1,000, maybe $2,000, all the way up to about $20,000. And we're now potentially starting to see, again, the similar signs in this cycle that something could happen along those lines. One thing as well just to note is if we look at something like the Bitcoin open interest, this is the BTC denominated open interest. So these are the total value of Bitcoin perpetual futures contracts. We can see that open interest has actually been fairly low and decreasing actually, which is kind of surprising. Usually when we get these very low periods of volatility, we usually see traders start placing their bets, trying to profit of the next big move in BTC, similar to what we saw, for example, prior to the FTX collapse in 2022, where we saw open interest absolutely skyrocketing. And then as soon as we got this big 20, near 30% massive downwards move, this open interest flushed out as lots of people were liquidated. But the fact that we had this huge increase in open interest probably increased the move that we got just because of the fact we get these cascades or squeezes in price action. If we also look at funding rates, it can make it a little bit more obvious. What typically happens is when we have a huge amount of positive funding rates, for example, and open interest is increasing, that usually indicates that a vast majority of traders are longing BTC. So when we finally do get a downwards move, what happens is traders with these open positions have to forcefully close them out. They are liquidated, and once they close this position out, it sells their BTC position, which decreases price slightly more. Then the next trader gets liquidated, and then the next one, the next, the next. So this squeezes price action to the downside or gives this liquidation cascade, and this can happen in both directions. But right now we're not actually seeing a huge amount of open interest or crazy funding rates, which leads me to believe that even though we currently have a very low amount of volatility, maybe it's not going to be as violent as we typically see when we get these big squeezes, but it may be more sustained because of that. What we may see is Bitcoin's price have this big breakout, and then as it'll mainly be a spot-driven rally, it'll be a little bit more sustainable and probably not just one of these big quick wicks to the downside before a quick wick to the upside. It reduces the chance of a fake out and massively increases the probability of the trend being sustained considerably longer. One other thing to mention is this definitely isn't just something that is impacting retail or everyday traders. What we can see is if we go to the ETF inflows chart here, this is something impacting institutional traders. When Bitcoin's volatility is incredibly low, we can see the funds, the daily amount of inflows into the BTC ETFs has decreased dramatically. ETF traders, institutional investors are again waiting for a bit more of a direction and confirmed trend in the BTC price action before putting more in. So what we are seeing is not just in the derivatives market, not just in the technical price action, but also as well in the institutional inflows, we are seeing a huge contraction. And this cyclical nature in interest volatility is just like price action. We have these huge phases of massive expansion, these huge phases of contraction, and it's just cyclical, as is human nature. So I do think Obviously, it's not going to be immediately. I mean, it may be in a few hours, it may be in a few days, maybe in a couple of weeks' time. But at some point, we are likely to see a huge move in the BTC price action, which will likely take us out of the range that we've been in for the past, well, as I said, feels like eternity, but really hasn't been too long. If I just go back to the TradingView chart here, what we can see is if I just draw on the chart some levels that I think could be interesting to watch. If I just remove the Bollinger Bands there. If we go back to the price action, as I said, I think if we draw a line somewhere around here and then somewhere around here has kind of been our range for a little while, maybe slightly higher than that. So I do think if we are to have a breakout, it'll probably be either to the downside beneath kind of $92,000. So I'd be watching for a break beneath this support level, retested as resistance, and that would probably confirm a slightly deeper retracement to the downside. If we are to break to the upside, which I think is slightly more likely, we're probably looking towards that $104,000 level to hopefully break above, turn back into support as it is currently resistance before we can break even higher. But as we said, this doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to break in the next couple days or hours. It could play out like this, which would take another couple days or even a couple more weeks before we have this huge expansion. But at some point, this range is going to break, just as all ranges do, and Bitcoin is going to have this huge move that we've really all been waiting for since back here in November time. So just to summarize, Bitcoin volatility is at one of its lowest levels in recent history, and volatility this low is rarely sustained and typically leads to a large move in the BTC price action. We could see in the historical comparisons just over the past year and the 3 occasions that that's happened, we've seen within just a couple weeks Bitcoin moves of 10, 20, even 30% or more following periods of low volatility like we're currently seeing. Although what we can say is the derivatives markets currently don't suggest a majority of traders are overexposed. What we could see from open interest and funding rates is they're both fairly neutral. So we may not see a huge squeeze and violent liquidation cascade to the upside or the downside. But what this does mean is that when we do get a more of a sustained trend change, that it's probably going to be a little bit more sustained. It's not going to be something that's just a flash in the pan, which may also help prevent fake outs where we usually see a break in one direction before it breaks back down. Hopefully, because this is going to be mainly a spot driven move and at the minute there's a low level of leverage in the market, hopefully it can be just an easier, more gradual move to the upside and sustained for a longer volatile breakout. And what we can say is, even though anticipating the direction of the volatility is harder than just predicting when we may get a volatile move, we do have some reason to be optimistic looking at something like the US dollar strength index and that decreasing, which gives us some optimism that we have slightly more favorable macroeconomic conditions for BTC in the coming weeks and months. If you like this video, then please visit bitcoinmagazinepro.com, where our analytics help you to cut through the noise to make informed, data-driven decisions about Bitcoin. With over 150 live chats, personalized indicator alerts, in-depth crypto industry reports, API access, and more, all for a fraction of the standard industry price. And let me know what your thoughts are on Bitcoin potentially having a big volatile move in the near future. Do you think that we are going to see something like that? Do you think we're going to remain in this range for potentially a few more months? And if we do see a big breakout, do you anticipate it's going to be to the upside or maybe to the downside? As I said, let me know in the comments below and on social media. I look forward to reading and replying to them. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.